The dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light that pierced the heavy velvet curtains of my aunt's study. It was a room that had always smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and a faint, lingering scent of the pipe tobacco Uncle Thomas had given up years before his passing. Now it just smelled of stale grief. My cousin, Isabella, stood by the window, her back rigid, staring out at the manicured yet lifeless garden. She was clutching a few sheets of paper in her hand, her knuckles white. From across the room, I could see the slight tremor in her fingers. For the last hour, she had been pacing, muttering lines to herself, her brow furrowed in a way that was so reminiscent of her mother. Isabella was to deliver the eulogy, the final poignant word on her father's life. It was a heavy burden, and she was carrying it like a physical weight upon her slender shoulders. My heart went out to her. Despite the years of carefully maintained distance between our sides of the family, she was still my cousin. In that moment of shared loss, the invisible lines that had been drawn between us felt particularly absurd. I pushed myself off the leather armchair, the soft sigh of the cushion breaking the oppressive silence. "Isabella?" I said, my voice softer than I intended. She didn't turn, but her shoulders tightened. "What?" I was reading over what you've written." I motioned toward the discarded, crumpled drafts on the mahogany desk. "It's beautiful, but you seem stuck." I took a tentative step closer. "Sometimes it helps to say it out loud to someone. If you want to practice, I'm here. I can help you with the flow, just to make it feel more comfortable." My offer was genuine. I had spent my career in communications, shaping words to convey precise emotions. I knew how to make a sentence land, how to build a rhythm that could hold an audience, how to find the cadence of sincerity. And I wanted, more than anything, to help her honor her father, my uncle. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sound was the frantic rustling of the papers in her hand. I thought she was considering it. I thought perhaps this shared grief could be a bridge. Then she turned. Her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, were not filled with the sadness I expected, but with a cold, sharp resentment. She looked at me, her gaze sweeping over me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. "Help!" she hissed, the word a venomous dart. "Why would I need your help?" She took a step toward me, the papers rattling in her fist like a rattlesnake's warning. "You have no idea what he was like, what this family is. You were never really here. You'd fly in for a holiday, smile at the parties, and then you'd be gone. This," she shook the papers in my face, "is about a lifetime. It's about my father." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cutting whisper that was more wounding than any shout. "It's not your family." The words struck me with a physical force. "It's not your family." It was a sentiment I had felt in unspoken glances and polite, exclusionary conversations my entire life, but I had never heard it articulated so plainly, so cruelly. My mother had married into this world of old money and intricate, unspoken rules. She had been an outsider, and by extension, so had I. We were adjacent, orbiting the brilliant, burning sun of their core unit, but never truly a part of it. My uncle had always been kind to me, a warm presence in a world that often felt chilly, but to Isabella, that kindness was apparently a footnote, a minor detail. To her, I was a tourist in her life, and this sacred moment of grief was a private affair. A cold calm washed over me, extinguishing the warmth of the sympathy I had felt just moments before. My hand went instinctively to the small, elegant clutch purse on the desk beside me. Inside it was a single, folded envelope, given to me by my uncle's lawyer just that morning, with the instruction that it was a personal addendum to be read at my discretion. I had my own words to share, not about my uncle's grand legacy, but about a small, quiet promise he had made to me. A promise I had intended to share with Isabella privately, after the formal proceedings were done. But her words had changed everything. They had redrawn the lines I had tried so hard to ignore. She wanted a clear distinction between her family and me. Fine, she would have it. I gave her a small, tight smile. "You're right, Isabella. Forgive me for intruding." I turned, picked up my purse, and walked out of the study, leaving her alone with her trembling hands and her bitter, exclusive grief. As I found my seat in the formal living room where the family was gathering, I caught the lawyer's eye. I gave him a subtle, decisive nod. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Isabella would have her moment to speak, but the lawyer would read my part first. The drawing room was an exercise in strained formality. Aunts and uncles I saw only at weddings and funerals were arranged on stiff-backed chairs, their faces composed in masks of solemnity. They were masters of the art of public grief, a performance of quiet dignity that I had always found more chilling than comforting. I took a seat near the back, my small clutch purse feeling heavy as a stone in my lap. A few minutes later, Isabella swept in, her head held high, the pages of her eulogy now resting neatly in a leather-bound folder. She looked composed, ready for her leading role. She offered a slight regal nod to the room at large and made her way toward the front, where a small lectern had been placed beside the lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, a portly man with a kind but weary face, rose to his feet. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the unnaturally quiet room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice a practiced, gentle baritone. "We are here today to honor the memory of a remarkable man, Thomas Ashworth. Before we proceed to the formal reading of the will, and before his daughter Isabella shares her eulogy, Thomas left a specific instruction with me, a small, personal addendum he wished to have shared at this moment." A murmur, soft as the rustle of silk, rippled through the room. All eyes flickered toward Isabella, whose mask of composure tightened. A faint line of confusion appeared between her brows. This was not in her script. She had expected to be the first to speak, to set the tone for the entire proceeding. Mr. Davies glanced in my direction, and I gave him the same subtle nod I had in the hallway. He reached for an identical sealed envelope on his table, a clear signal that this was official, not a personal whim of mine. He broke the wax seal with a practiced thumb. "Thomas wrote this himself, just a few months ago," Mr. Davies explained, holding up the single sheet of paper. "He asked that it be read, unedited, before any other words were spoken." He put on his spectacles and began to read. "To my beloved family," the lawyer's voice now channeled the familiar warm tone of my uncle, and a lump formed in my throat. "As you gather today, I imagine the air is thick with the weight of memory. It is a weight I am sorry to leave you with, but a life fully lived is a heavy thing to pack away. Most of you knew me as a husband, a father, a brother, a businessman. You knew the public man, the man who built a legacy of which I am deeply proud. But an old man is allowed his private reflections, and there is a piece of my life, a quiet joy, that I feel I did not honor enough in public." The room was utterly still. Even Isabella seemed to be holding her breath. "There is a person in this room," Mr. Davies continued reading, "who, through no fault of her own, has often stood at the periphery of our family's center. My niece, Clara." I felt the shift in the room's energy as dozens of pairs of eyes swiveled to find me in my corner chair. I kept my gaze fixed on the lawyer, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Clara's mother, my dear sister-in-law, married into our world, and I know it was not always an easy fit. And Clara, in turn, often felt like a guest in our home rather than kin. That was a failure of ours, and one I regret. But what many of you never saw were the hours Clara and I spent in my study. While others saw a collection of dusty books, she saw a universe. She did not ask me about stock portfolios or property values. She asked me about the Peloponnesian War. She didn't see my first edition of Moby Dick as an asset. She saw it as a conversation with history. She shared a part of my soul that I thought I would carry with me to the grave unshared. Isabella's face was now a pale blank canvas. The folder in her hand seemed to tremble slightly. "My daughter, Isabella, knew my love for our family's legacy," the letter went on, and the words were a gentle yet devastating blow. "She understood the importance of our name, our standing, but Clara understood me. She understood the quiet man who found more truth in a line of poetry than a ledger of accounts. Therefore, it is my final and most heartfelt wish, a matter not of law but of my heart's own testament, that my entire personal library, including all first editions and my personal journals kept within the study, be given to my niece, Clara. It is not an inheritance of wealth, but an inheritance of spirit. I know she will be its finest guardian." Mr. Davies folded the paper slowly and placed it on the table. "That is the conclusion of the addendum," he said quietly. He then looked directly at Isabella, his expression one of professional pity. "Isabella," he said, "if you are ready." The room's attention swung back to her. She stood frozen for a moment, the eulogy she had so fiercely protected now feeling like an afterthought. Her story of her father had just been publicly and lovingly amended. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable, and in that silence I saw the truth of her father's words. He had seen me. He had made sure in the end that everyone else did too. For a few heartbeats, Isabella didn't move. She stood as if turned to stone, her face a mask of disbelief. The air in the room was electric with unspoken thoughts. Every eye was on her, waiting. The eulogy she had so carefully crafted, The one she had declared was about her father now felt like a secondary act. She had been upstaged by a ghost. With a visible effort, she drew herself up, her spine straightening into a rod of pure, defiant pride. She walked the few steps to the lectern with a steady, measured gait, her heels clicking softly on the polished hardwood floor. She opened the leather folder and smoothed the pages with a hand that I knew, despite its steadiness, must have been ice cold. She looked out at the assembled family, her gaze sweeping past me as if my chair were empty. "My father," she began, her voice shockingly clear and controlled, "was a man of great presence. He built an empire from the ground up. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose name meant something." The words were strong, the delivery flawless. She spoke of his business acumen, of the charities he supported, of the grand public figure the world knew. She painted a portrait of a powerful, influential man, the patriarch of a dynasty. It was a good speech, a powerful eulogy for a titan of industry. But after the intimacy of her father's letter, it sounded hollow. He had spoken of his soul. She was speaking of his resume. Listening to her, I felt a strange and unwelcome pang of pity. The story she was telling was true, but it was an incomplete truth. She had loved the father who built things, the father who was a name, a legacy. She was eulogizing the king, but she had missed the man. My uncle's letter hadn't just given me his books. It had revealed a part of him that Isabella, in her fierce proprietary grief, had never truly known. She spoke of summers at the lake house, of grand Christmas parties, of the traditions and rituals that defined their family. But these were all public family moments, events where the Ashworths were on display. It was a narrative of a collective, of us. There were no quiet, personal anecdotes. There was no mention of his love for poetry, his quiet chuckle when he'd read a particularly witty line from Mark Twain, his habit of tapping his pipe on the windowsill while lost in thought. She was eulogizing the institution of her father, not the man who had sat in his worn leather chair and traveled the world through the pages of his books. When she finished, her voice ringing with a final declarative statement about his enduring legacy, the room responded with polite, subdued applause. It was the applause one gives at a corporate dinner, not the heartfelt silence that follows a truly moving tribute. She had held her ground, she had performed her duty, but the emotional heart of the day had already been claimed. Mr. Davies rose again and proceeded with the formal reading of the will. It was exactly as everyone expected. The vast majority of the estate, the houses, the stocks, the company shares, went to Isabella and her siblings. They were, without question, financially secure for generations to come. My name was not mentioned again. The material wealth was theirs. It was a clean, brutal line. They had the kingdom, I had the king's heart. As the formal proceedings concluded, the room broke into quiet, murmuring groups. A few of the older relatives, cousins of my grandmother who had always been kind to me in a detached way, approached me now with a new warmth in their eyes. "Clara, my dear," said one great-aunt, patting my hand. "Thomas always said you had an old soul. He was so proud of you." Another uncle leaned in. "He told me once that you were the only one who understood his dusty old hobby, as he called it. I'm so glad he did that. It's right. It's just right." This was the validation, the quiet confirmation from the fringes that my uncle's words were not just a whim, but a long-held truth. Through the clusters of relatives, I could see Isabella. She was a frozen island in a sea of condolences, surrounded by her mother and siblings, a tight, protective phalanx. Her mother, my Aunt Caroline, shot a look in my direction that was so full of cold fury it could have frozen water. Finally, Isabella began to move. She walked stiffly across the room, not toward me, but toward the grand archway leading to the hall. For a single charged second, our paths were aligned. She had to pass directly in front of me. She didn't slow down, but she lifted her head and our eyes met. I had expected to see anger, resentment, hatred, and I did. But underneath it, churning in the depths of her dark, exhausted eyes, was something far more profound. A look of utter, devastating bewilderment. It was the look of someone whose entire map of the world had just been torn to pieces. The story she had told herself her entire life, the story of being the sole keeper of her father's heart, had been a fiction. And she knew, in that moment, that I had known the truth all along. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The look was enough. She broke eye contact and swept past me, a queen abandoning her own coronation. I stood there for another moment, the sympathetic pats on my arm feeling distant and unreal. The victory felt strangely like a loss. I had been given a home, but I had also been handed a war. Excusing myself, I walked away from the polite murmurs and the resentful glares, down the hall, and pushed open the door to the study. My study. The room was just as I had left it. The dust motes still danced in the light. The scent of old paper and lemon polish seemed to welcome me. It smelled like peace. It smelled like him. I ran my hand over the worn leather of his armchair, the place where he had sat and shared his universe with me. It was not a throne, but it had been his entire world. And now, it was mine. I walked over to the grand mahogany desk, my fingers tracing the faint overlapping rings left by my uncle's coffee cup over countless mornings. On the corner sat a heavy, leather-bound book with a tarnished brass clasp. It was one of his personal journals. I had seen him writing in it countless times, a quiet ritual after he'd finished the newspaper, but had never dared to ask what secrets it held. It felt impossibly intimate, a conversation he was having with himself, and now it was part of a conversation he had willed to me. The door clicked open, and I didn't need to turn to know who was there. The silence that followed was a stark contrast to the room's earlier peace. This silence was a living thing, heavy and charged with accusation. "You must be very pleased with yourself," Isabella said. Her voice was brittle, stripped of its earlier icy control and scraped raw with emotion. I turned to face her. She stood just inside the doorway, framed like a portrait of indignation. The bewilderment I had seen earlier had curdled into a raw, painful rage. "This wasn't about being pleased, Isabella," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This was never a competition." "Wasn't it?" she shot back, taking a defiant step into the room. Her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, scanned the shelves, the desk, the armchair, as if seeing them for the first time as a territory she had unknowingly surrendered. "You were always there, weren't you? In the corner, at every party, every holiday, just watching. I always thought you were pathetic, that you didn't know how to belong. But you were just biding your time, weren't you? The quiet little mouse, secretly winning over the king. You manipulated him. You made him think you were the only one who truly saw him." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I could have been angry, but hearing the desperation beneath her words, all I felt was a profound sadness. "He didn't think I saw him," I replied, the truth of it settling upon me with a sad clarity. "He felt it, just like you felt you were the only one who understood his legacy. You were both right. He was a big man. He had room for more than one truth." I picked up the worn copy of Moby Dick from the mantelpiece, its spine soft as felt beneath my fingers. "Did you ever read this with him?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I was busy helping him run an empire. I didn't have time for dusty old adventure stories." "It wasn't an adventure story to him," I said softly, my thumb stroking the faded cover. "He told me once, sitting right in that chair, that the world saw him as a man who had built a safe harbor, but he felt like Ahab. He felt a relentless pull to chase something immense and unknowable, something that had nothing to do with stock prices or boardrooms. This book wasn't about a whale. It was about a hunger he couldn't name. It was about being lonely, out on a vast sea, even when surrounded by people who loved him." I looked at her, truly looked at her, hoping she would see. "He loved the man you saw, Isabella, the patriarch, the builder. He was immensely proud of that man, but he was tired. In here, with these books, he didn't have to be an institution. He could just be Thomas." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief, terrifying glimpse of the truth she had been avoiding. The idea that her father, the pillar of her world, had felt lonely or unfulfilled was a crack in the very foundation of her identity, but it was a truth too painful to accept. Her features hardened again, the mask of cold fury slamming back into place. "So you think you knew his secret, sad little heart?" She spat, the words dripping with disdain. "Fine, take it. Take his books and his melancholy. Read them until your eyes bleed. It doesn't matter. I am his daughter. I carry his name. I am his living, breathing legacy. All you are," she paused, searching for the most dismissive word she could find, "is a curator of his hobby." She turned on her heel and walked out, pulling the door shut behind her. It didn't slam. It closed with a soft, final click, a sound of absolute severance. The word curator hung in the air, meant as an insult, but it landed on me like a calling, a sacred duty. She was right. She was the legacy of Ashworth the Titan. I was the legacy of Thomas the Man. I was left alone in the sudden, profound quiet of my study. My study. The title felt real now. Earned. I sat down in his armchair, the worn leather sighing as it took my weight. It felt like coming home. I reached for the journal on the desk, its weight substantial in my hands. I ran my thumb over the intricate brass clasp before unfastening it. I opened it to the first page. In my uncle's familiar, elegant script, a message was waiting for me. It read, "For Clara. My dear girl, I leave you my best companions and my truest self. I trust you with them. Start with page 73. It's where our story really begins." My eyes filled with tears, hot and cleansing. Tears not of grief for what was lost, but of overwhelming gratitude for what was found. I was not an intruder. I was not a footnote. I was the keeper of his truest story. And it was, finally, time to begin reading. Every life is a library of stories, with public histories and private, dog-eared chapters. Sometimes the truest parts of a person are not found in the legacy they build, but in the quiet passions they cultivate. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who understands the beauty of looking past the cover and appreciating the soul of the story within. For it is a powerful reminder that everyone we know has a hidden world, waiting to be discovered.